If you need something to feel complex before you trust it, you're already filtering out the opportunities that could move your life forward. Because the ones that change your trajectory early don't look sophisticated. They look obvious, and that's exactly why they get ignored. You see what others don't. Patterns, inconsistencies, hidden variables. That's an advantage until clarity itself starts triggering suspicion. Now, instead of asking, does this work, you start asking, what am I missing? And that question doesn't close, so the decision stays open. While you're refining your understanding, the conditions shift, timing softens, access narrows. The same opportunity that looked simple now feels uncertain. Not because it changed, but because your threshold for action quietly moved higher. That's the mechanism. Detail starts crowding out signal. Intelligence stops filtering noise and starts amplifying it. And over time, you don't just miss one opportunity. You develop a pattern where 5 years pass, your position looks similar, and the people who moved earlier now have leverage you can't access from the outside. This isn't about being reckless. It's about recognizing when your analysis has turned into a closed loop that replaces movement with refinement. I'll show you 3 signs you're filtering out obvious opportunities, and 1 adjustment that resets your threshold for action without lowering your standards. There's a certain kind of person who tends to notice things others don't. They catch inconsistencies in conversations. They see patterns in behavior. They read between the lines, often without trying. In meetings, they're the ones quietly observing what isn't being said. In everyday situations, they pick up on small details most people move past without a second thought. This usually feels like an advantage. When something seems too simple, they pause. When something looks obvious, they take a closer look. Not because they're hesitant, but because they're used to finding what others miss. And often, they're right. There is something more beneath the surface, so over time, a habit forms. Simple decisions get a second pass. Clear opportunities get inspected from multiple angles. Even straightforward situations start to feel like they might contain hidden variables. Something subtle, something easy to overlook. And most of the time, nothing is wrong with that. But occasionally, something strange starts to happen. 2 people can look at the exact same situation, the same offer, the same opening, the same moment, and walk away with completely different conclusions. One moves quickly, almost casually. The other slows down, starts evaluating, starts questioning. Not because the opportunity changed, but because the way it's being seen did. And at first, that difference is almost invisible. At first, the difference feels like caution. A simple opportunity appears, clear upside, low complexity, nothing obviously wrong. But instead of moving, the mind starts scanning, not just for risks, but for what might be missing. Because truly simple situations start to feel incomplete. If something is valuable, it should be competitive. If it's obvious, others should already be there. If it's easy to understand, maybe it's already too late. So clarity begins to trigger suspicion, not consciously. It doesn't feel like doubt. It feels like thoroughness, like taking the time to see the full picture before stepping in. And each additional layer of analysis seems justified on its own. But something subtle shifts. The question is no longer, is this good? It becomes, what am I not seeing yet? And that question doesn't resolve easily. Because the more you look for hidden variables, the more you find possibilities. Not certainties, just possibilities. Small uncertainties that wouldn't stop most people, but are enough to keep the process open. So the decision stays unfinished. Meanwhile, the situation itself doesn't stand still. It doesn't announce that it's changing. It just slowly becomes less immediate, less accessible, slightly less favorable. Nothing dramatic happens, just a quiet transition from clear to uncertain. At this point, nothing feels like a mistake. There's no clear loss, no obvious failure, just a decision that hasn't been made yet. The reasoning still feels solid. Wait a little longer, understand a little more, reduce a bit more uncertainty. Because better information always feels like it's just around the corner. Maybe one more data point will clarify things. Maybe timing will become more obvious. Maybe the risk will reveal itself more clearly. So the decision stays open. But the opportunity doesn't stay the same. It doesn't disappear all at once. It shifts quietly. The conditions that made it attractive begin to soften. The timing changes slightly. The advantage becomes less pronounced. And because the change is gradual, it's hard to notice exactly when it stopped being the same opportunity. From the outside, it still looks available. From the inside, it no longer feels as clear. And that creates a strange effect. Now, even if the person decides to move, the reasoning is different. It's no longer based on clarity, it's based on hesitation catching up. The moment that felt obvious before now requires justification. And often, that's where it ends. Not with a clear rejection, but with a quiet drift away from something that was once simple and a trajectory that, without noticing, hasn't really moved forward. By now, the process feels familiar. An opportunity appears. It gets examined from multiple angles. Variables are considered. Scenarios are projected. Ihtimalat are weighed. Nothing unusual, just a thorough way of thinking. But something subtle begins to fold inward. The analysis is no longer focused only on the opportunity. It starts to include itself. Am I evaluating this correctly? Is there a bias in how I'm seeing this? What would a more informed version of me notice here? At first, this seems like a higher level of thinking, more precise, more refined. But it introduces a loop, because every conclusion now becomes something to re-evaluate. Every level of clarity opens the door to another level of doubt, not about the opportunity, but about the process used to understand it. And that loop doesn't naturally close. There's always another angle to consider, another interpretation, another possibility that hasn't been ruled out yet. So instead of moving toward a decision, the thinking becomes self-reinforcing. It feels productive, it feels like progress, but the position doesn't actually change. And over time, this creates a quiet separation between understanding something deeply and ever actually stepping into it. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. But inside the process, movement has been replaced by refinement. From the outside, it can look confusing. Someone with less information, less analysis, less certainty moves first. They don't seem to question as much. They don't map out every variable. They see something that works, something that makes sense at a basic level, and they step in, not recklessly, just earlier. And in many cases, that's enough, because certain opportunities don't require full understanding to work. They don't reward perfect timing or complete certainty. They reward presence, being there while the conditions are still simple. But from a more analytical perspective, that same situation can feel incomplete. There are gaps, unknowns, things that haven't been fully validated yet. And those gaps matter, not because they're critical, but because they're visible. So the process continues. More evaluation, more comparison, more time spent trying to reach a level of clarity that matches the complexity being perceived. Meanwhile, something else becomes visible. The people who moved early are no longer evaluating the opportunity. They're inside it. Learning from direct exposure, adjusting in real time, gaining advantages that weren't available from observation alone, and this creates a quiet inversion. The ones who seemed less prepared now have better positioning, not because they understood more, but because they entered while understanding less was still enough. At a certain point, the pattern stops looking like caution. It starts to look structural. Because the issue isn't just taking longer to decide, it's what fills the space during that time. The attention that was supposed to clarify the opportunity is now distributed across too many elements. Details, edge cases, unlikely scenarios, second-order effects. Individually, each one makes sense to consider, but together they begin to compete with something much simpler, the core signal that made the opportunity visible in the first place. And that signal doesn't get stronger with analysis. It gets diluted. What was once a clear "this works" becomes surrounded by layers of "but what about?" Not because the opportunity changed, but because the frame used to evaluate it expanded beyond what the situation actually required. So the mind does something subtle. It upgrades the standard of certainty. What used to be enough to act now feels insufficient. What used to be obvious now feels incomplete. And the threshold for action quietly moves higher without ever being explicitly defined. This is where intelligence shifts roles. Instead of filtering noise, it starts amplifying it, not intentionally, just as a consequence of being able to see more and not all of what's seen having equal weight. And once that happens, something important becomes harder to detect. Not complexity, but simplicity itself. In the end, nothing about the opportunity was especially complex. It didn't require rare insight. It didn't depend on secret information. It wasn't reserved for people who understood more. It was visible from the beginning, clear enough to recognize, simple enough to act on, available in a form that didn't demand perfect certainty, just a willingness to enter before everything was fully resolved. But somewhere along the way, that simplicity stopped feeling sufficient. Not because it changed, but because the standard used to evaluate it did. The same clarity that made the opportunity accessible started to make it look incomplete. The same lack of friction that made it easy to enter started to feel like something was missing. So the search continued for more confirmation, more validation, a version of the opportunity that would feel as sophisticated as the thinking applied to it. And that version never arrived, because it was never required. By the time that becomes visible, the situation usually looks different, less immediate, less obvious, sometimes already occupied by those who didn't need the full picture to begin. And that's the quiet resolution. The opportunity wasn't hidden. It only stopped looking obvious to the person who needed it to feel complex before it felt real.